Okay, let's see if this works. I've been having problems with YouTube all morning trying to go live. So I posted a video and then there were like problems with the video or something. So I took it down and I'm gonna retry it. Um, and maybe this will be a little quicker because I've already gotten the rough draft out out of my head, and maybe got my thoughts a little bit more organized this time. Um, okay, so I want to talk about testing for FI polar, which, if you're familiar with talking with famous people and Eric's, defensible typology testing, typing sessions that he does, he, sort of frequently talks about how he doesn't really have a very good FI polar test, and or really FE for that matter, I think as well. FE, I think he sort of goes off of the vibe, which is actually usually pretty easy to do if somebody's got front stack FE. But sort of trying to pinpoint whether somebody's FI polar or where they are FI. He admittedly, doesn't really have a reliable test that he uses. And so, I was listening to one of his most recent testing sessions, and the guy came out as an ISFP, I think. And but along the way, Eric was trying to pinpoint, where exactly, is this guy an FE user, an FI user? Because he was sort of debating, I think, between a couple of different types, and it sort of depended on whether or not this guy was FI or FE. And one thing that I've noticed in his typing sessions is the feeling functions, FI and FE, are really the only ones where he kind of pits the same function, extroverted versus introverted, against each other, where he tries to determine whether somebody sort of takes an FI approach or an FE approach to a particular situation or scenario. And but he doesn't really do that a whole lot with the other functions, at least not that I've noticed, right? TI, he sort of tests in a vacuum. TE, he sort of tests in a vacuum. He might sort of give a TI test and a TI test and sort of see, maybe which one's stronger if it's sort of a jump ball, but he's not really pitting them against each other. Like, is this person using TI versus TE in this given situation? Where he does do that a lot with extroverted feeling and introverted feeling. He also doesn't see it so much with NI and NE, or so much with SE and SI. And instead, usually what he's doing is he's pitting the, SI versus NI, which are two knowledge functions, against each other. Where it's, somebody's either NI or they're clearly SI. Clearly, it's all relative. But, and I think that might be the better approach here. If you're trying to determine whether or not somebody is quote unquote FI or has FI front stack, or maybe more importantly, if they're FI polar, I think you want to pit the FI deliberation function against the counterpart deliberation function. That would be TI. So instead of trying to figure out if somebody takes an FI approach versus an FE approach, I think it makes more sense to see if they take an FI approach versus a TI approach. Because what you saw in the ISFP video, is Eric asked a question. It was the sort of, do you put yourself in the person's shoes, or do you rely on reading visual cues to determine, what somebody's thinking or how they're feeling? But somebody who's a lead feeler, they've got first slot FI, fifth slot FE, they might be able to interchange between those two pretty easily, right? And use either approach. And so if they're lead feeler, it might be really hard to tease apart that. And that also could be true even if they're, 4 and 8 or 2 and 6. They might be able to, it might be hard to tease it apart. Unless one of them's polar, right? But figuring out, whether somebody takes more of an FI approach to deliberation versus a TI approach might help, determine whether somebody is front stack FI or back stack FI. So let me get some examples and see where, I'm sort of getting with this. Because to me, and this sort of goes back to my previous video about the art history stuff. You got two deliberation functions, and one of them's doing the objective calculus or the disinterested calculus. Thank you to the commenter who reminded me what the term is that Eric uses. I couldn't remember that term for the life of me. But the disinterested calculus, you've got TI, where it's doing a deliberation, so it's trying to come up with a conclusion about something. And that's what deliberation is. It's trying to come up with some sort of conclusion about various things. And so here it's trying to conclude whether something's valid or not, or whether it sort of matches up with your logical syllogisms, or the rules that you have that sort of define what something is or is not. And so it is either valid or it is not valid. It doesn't depend on the context, doesn't depend on the person, doesn't depend on what mood you're in, or what sort of patriarchy or colonization you're living within. It is objectively valid or it is not objectively valid. And it would be true for me, it'd be true for you, assuming that we run the program correctly, and follow all the rules correctly, we should be coming to the same conclusion, right? So it is therefore, an objective calculus, where the FI, is at its very core level is looking at the valence of something, whether it's positive or negative. But as you sort of scale up and add, sort of layers to that, what you can get is, a system that can figure out whether something's fair or not, whether something's ethical or not. I like to think of it as your fairness generator. Is this thing fair? And if it's fair, I like it. If it's not fair, I don't like it. But the issue is, even though we could take the same facts and run them through our FI fairness generator, we could come out to wildly different conclusions about whether or not something's fair or not. And it depends on our first principles, right? What our ethical our framework is, right? So I might have a ethical framework that starts off with, I look for something that's going to give, people with the most individual freedom and the least amount of governmental interference, right? And let's just say I take like that sort of libertarian stance, right? And somebody else could have a very different first principle, and they're looking for a result that's going to, result in sort of the best balance of the equities, right? Making sure that certain disadvantaged groups are not, taken advantage of, and that, they're sort of given a quote unquote fair or equitable outcome, and so we might, wildly disagree on whether or not something is ethical, because we're coming to it with different starting places, right? Different frameworks of what we view as ethical or not. And somebody else could come along with sort of like utilitarian sort of approach of, does it, benefit society, benefit the most people, that kind of thing. And so whatever sort of policy decision or court case or whatever we're trying to make a decision about or make a conclusion about, again, we can come to wildly different outcomes depending on where we start. Okay. So that's fundamentally the difference between FI and TI. And you see it everywhere, right? Once you sort of understand that, that fundamental difference, you see it everywhere. And I think it's one of these insights that gives you a lot of information about a person, whether they have more of a TI ethical, or if they have more of a TI approach about the world or an FI approach about the world. And clearly, if they're polar, right, I think. And so if somebody is TI polar, then they're going to see the world in a very FI type of way, a very FI lens, and and so they'll see, these are sort of the postmodernist, Foucault's and Derrida's, where there is no objective truth, there is no um, there are no rules that we can all agree, must be the case, or conclusions that must be the case. It's all just the grand narrative and what the power structure has decided are the rules. But, it doesn't mean that if we started all over or started on a different planet or multiverse, we would come up with the same rules, because there are no objective rules, right? And so it comes to these sort of outlandish, conclusions. I'm going to talk about some of them in a second here, where the TI users, the ENTPs, the ESTPs, just don't see it that way at all. They are more likely to see the world as having an objective set of rules, and all this FI stuff is just sort of doesn't really have its place in deliberation, on most things, like where you're going to go to eat, what you're going to wear, that kind of stuff. Fine, because that's subjective to you, and it doesn't really, it's not anything that's intended to be universal. But when we're talking about big things, universal things, then we have to accept that there's going to be some objective best way of coming up with a conclusion. So, where does this manifest itself, and what can you do? I think law school is probably like the best way, the best illustration of the TI versus FI mindset. And originally, or at least 100 years ago, law schools were intended to, what their intent was to get everybody, all the students and all the lawyers, to think in a TI way, that there's an objective way of looking at the law, and that the law was just like math, and we just had to discover, like, what the axioms and the theorems were, that for any particular legal subject matter, contracts, property, criminal law, constitutional law, whatever, there's some sort of underlying objective formula to where we get the correct answer, for any case that's presented in front of us, right? We're going to come up with the correct answer because the law is objective, and it's just our job to figure out, what those underlying principles or rules are. Now, of course, taken to its extreme, you get, sort of fascist Nazism, right? Where there, is this true objective, this true reality, and everybody needs to just accept it and follow along. And so obviously there was this backlash, after World War II and whatnot, against that sort of, approach. And so, of course, over the past, 80 years or so, you've seen this dynamic shift to where it's more now, law school is more about trying to get people to think of it in a more FI kind of way, right? Like to look at the inequities of the situation, and looking at the power differences, and what's really going on here, in this case, as opposed to just looking at what does the contract say, right? Or what does the statute say? You're supposed to look at sort of, the equities of the situation, and sort of the FI part of it, right? Is this an ethical conclusion? Is the court making its decision, or is its decision ethically sound, as opposed to objectively and legally sound, which would be more the TI approach? And so when I was in law school, that was the battle between the old cagers, and some new guys that like come out of the Chicago school and stuff that see the law as, you know, purely um, an objective intellectual endeavor, and you're just trying to discover the, you know, the best objective outcomes. You know, a lot of ENTP economists weighing in, all that kind of stuff. And then versus the other part of, you know, the law school, which is looking more at the social justice and the equities, and, you know, whether or not, you know, you can fight City Hall, right? Whether or not somebody, you know, they lost the court case not because there was some hard and fast objective rule against them, but it was because of the power dynamics, the power structure, and the patriarchy and colonization and all of that, right? So that's sort of the intellectual battle that sort of, you know, way before even Jordan Peterson was a thing, has been sort of boiling in academia and law schools in particular for a long time. But to me, it all boils down to FI versus TI. And a good example of it is when I was in law school, there was a guy who's a really bright guy, went to, you know, a big top 10 undergrad university math major, which is kind of odd because he was an ENFP, clearly an ENFP, like head of the student ACLU, head of the student SBA. You know, just one of those guys that just was always fighting the true fight. Was from DC, went back to DC. He's been in government, just pure ENFP through and through. You know, really believes in the cause, in the fight, and but he just, and he was in my little study group where we would study together. So I got a pretty good insight into the way his mind worked and what he thought about, you know, various cases and stuff. And he just could not agree that there was an objective way of looking at the law, that everything was subjective, that everything was about power dynamics and social constructs. And, you know, just because a judge came to a conclusion doesn't mean that they were following any sort of objective logical reasoning. It was purely they knew the conclusion that they wanted to get to, and they just made up an argument to get there. Right? Like they knew that that they didn't want this person to win the case because this person, you know, had a certain ethical, you know, ethnic background or socioeconomic background, or the people on the other side were his buddies, or you know, rich businessmen or whatever, right? And that court cases were all about not, you know, discovering some sort of underlying logical principle about what, you know, the way contracts work or the way property law should work, and the way that we should sort of organize our, you know, our government and our communities around these principles. But instead, it was just, hey, you know, we're the ones in power and we want to stay in power. And here's a bunch of arguments that, you know, get us to the conclusion that we want to get to. Right. That's how he saw every case. Right. Not that, not, and so, you know, so if somebody was presenting a logical argument about whether or not, you know, there was a breach of contract, or whether or not somebody, um, you know, breached you know, fiduciary duty, or a negligence claim or something like that. Um, it wasn't an analysis of the facts and applying the facts to these rules. It was just coming up with an argument, you know, so that your side would win, right? Or the side that you wanted to win would win. And so he ended up not doing great in law school because he just could not get the TI part of it. You know, and again, we would talk about cases in class, and he was always the one to raise his hand and be like, "Well, isn't what really is going on here is, you know, this person was from this background or whatever." And sometimes that is the case, and sometimes that is exactly what the textbook is trying to push across. Because again, there is a whole side of academia who believes that, right? And he just happened to be on that side. So, but he, you know, he couldn't see the TI part of it. He just could not see the TI part of it. And I think you see this all the time now in a lot of these, um, culture war arguments that pop up on Twitter. But good example from a couple of years ago was this whole 2 + 2 = 5 argument. You might have seen it. If you haven't, Google it. You'll see a lot of ink was spilled on this one. And some professor, probably at Harvard or something, made a comment that 2 + 2 can = 5, and that and the underlying argument here is that there really is no objective truth. There's no objective rules. It's just we just all sort of agreed upon that 2 + 2 = 5. And I know the INTPs and the ENTPs and the ESTPs are all freaking out right now. I know, I get it. And then, of course, they all freaked out on Twitter. And they're just like, how can you possibly say that? It's math. It's obviously objectively true. If there's one thing in the world that's objectively true, it's math. And then, there's swarms of other people coming in on the other side saying, no, this is just the patriarchy, and this is just racism. And so you're getting all these posts, math is racist or science is racist, and you have math professors, from major institutions, weighing in and saying, to say that 2 + 2 = 5 is just upholding the patriarchy and acknowledging that there's an objective truth, and you're sending a signal to the youth of America that that there are objective rules that have to be followed, and because we say so, and we're the patriarchy, blah 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 blah. And so to me, it was just the classic battle between the ENFPs and the ESFPs versus the ENTPs and the ESTPs, right? Just battling out, because the ESTPs and ENTPs just can't fathom that yeah, there might be some things out there that are dependent on the patriarchy and all that, but at least give us math, right? At least give us that there is some objective, truth to the world. Where the others are like, no, we refuse to budge an inch because that's just your opinion, right? It's the classic ESFP, ENFP argument of that's just your opinion, or if it's not, that's just your opinion, that's racist or whatever, right? So I think you could so going back to the talking with famous people and the testing methodology, rather than try to, pit FI versus FE, and I get it if you're trying to fine tune where exactly something is, I understand that, but just at a very basic level, whether somebody's FI polar, I'd recommend, sort of getting into arguments or, discussions about whether or not there's an objective reality, or the extent to which there is an objective reality. I think FI polar types, ENTPs, ESTPs, I think they understand that there are, FI arguments and ethical arguments that stand apart from TI arguments. I don't think that they're trying to argue that it doesn't exist at all in the way that the FI people are trying to argue that TI doesn't really exist at all. I think there's a difference there. But I do think that the ENTPs and the ESTPs are more likely to see way more value and way more weight in the TI view of the world, that there really are rules. There really are underlying laws, right? So, a good example would be like the Milton Friedman economist, the whole Chicago school economics approach or discipline of where, they really think there are these fundamental rules that are like the best rules to run your economy. And not only the economy, but just the law, the laws regulating the economy. And that, they are, almost as true as math itself. And it's just, sort of up to us to sort of figure out how it all sort of pieces together. And, so that's what they call the law and economics group. And I think if you have somebody who's FI polar, they're definitely going to fall more into that camp, that, that there's sort of there's a broader range of social things or cultural things that follow objective formulas. So, like art, the law, music, cooking, just a lot of things that maybe, other people who are not FI polar see as more sort of FI like. So getting into conversations like that might help. I think it also would have, obviously test the TI polar types, the extent to which they think there is an objective reality or if it's all just made up, Um, I don't have, I guess I don't really have any like specific things in mind, but I'm just thinking more just an approach or a general method. Um, let's see here. The other thing I wanted to point out, which is probably going to make some people mad, but okay, whatever. But again, outside of just sort of the typing sessions or trying to figure out, individuals or running the typing sessions, it's also sort of a good way to read people. If somebody is FI polar, they tend to be a little weaselly, a little car salesman-y, right? Where they will sort of push things. Start thinking of the classic ESTP, Donald Trump car salesman, business guy. It's just going to sort of push the deal in their favor and sort of rely on technicalities and rely on ambiguities that sort of work in their favor. Where somebody who is front stack FI, even ESTJs, I say this in ESTJs all the time, where if they have to make a decision, they have to engage their deliberation function and they'll ask, well, is this fair? Does this seem fair? Are we treating the other side fairly? Are we treating ourselves fairly? Are we treating the employees fairly? They really do care that whatever is done is sort of fair to everybody. Even though it might be fourth function, it's still the deliberation function that they tend to use. Where an ESTP, ENTP, I don't want to say. I don't want to say they like go like in unethical areas or anything like that, but they're more willing to live with ambiguity. More willing to sort of push things and be like, well, if somebody ever argues against this, we can always argue X, Y, and Z, which is usually sort of a technicality. Like we can usually win on a technicality in a very TI kind of approach. Where on the other hand, if somebody's TI polar, so your ESFPs or ENFPs, when they get sort of backed up into an argument, they're immediately going to play the race card or the gender card or the, class card or patriarchy card or whatever, and try to take it out of, I'm sort of losing on the TI logical grounds here, but let's really look at what's going on. You're just, the only reason I'm in this situation is because you're a racist, that kind of thing. And again, sometimes that could be true. Not trying to say it's not always true, but if somebody's TI polar, you're just going to see them sort of jump to more of an ethical type of argument, right? And try to change the battleground from the TI argument to more of the FI argument. Now, that might be hard to do in a testing session because you don't really want to argue with the people you're testing, but you can sort of, dance around, questions or something and see the extent to which they think something, there's just this absolute logical truth to something versus it's all up to interpretation. Now, one last thing I wanted to say is that this is why I think the IJs, the ISTJs, INFJs, INTJs, and ISTJs, all of your IJs, tend to be, in my opinion, like the best lawyers, the best judges, because we're not polar in TI or FI. It might be in our one of those might be in our sixth slot, but we can at least pull it in to and sort of use it on a needed basis. And we tend to be able to see both the FI argument and the TI argument to something, right? And again, law school is a large part about trying to tease out FI arguments versus TI arguments because it's trying to have you see it from both sides, right? Is it technically, legally, the right conclusion? Sure, but is it fair, right? Does it really meet the equities of the situation? You might win on the merits, but it's not really a fair outcome. Things like having a 200-page contract from your cell phone provider, and then in very little legal writing, it's like you have some $500 termination fee or something if you ever terminate your contract. Is that fair? I mean, yeah, if you terminate your contract, that's what the contract says. TI wise, objectively, you owe that $500. It's that's an objective legal conclusion. Given the facts of the situation, you signed it. It's in there in writing, maybe even in bold. Who knows? But is it fair? Is it equitable? Right? You've got these major, corporations, and there's only so many we can go to, and they all have the same contract. Blah 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 blah. So those are sort of the arguments that you learn to develop in law school. And sort of teasing those apart, And again, ENTPs, ESTPs, they're going to be good. I mean, they're going to understand there's the FI part of it. They're just, not really going to live their lives accordingly. I think, they probably find it. They're probably, if anybody is sort of, taken aback or upset with when the court goes to an FI conclusion, right, where it was clearly in the contract or it was clearly in the law that this person was violating this statute or whatever. It's clear as day, but the court still decided, but it's not really equitable in the situation. It's not really fair in the situation. I think the ESTPs and the ENTPs really grinds their gears, and so maybe try to find a scenario or two, that's going to sort of grind somebody's gears when the court or legislature or whoever the decision-making body is decides to use an FI approach as opposed to a TI approach. And they're all over the place in the old case law, example of cases out there. Okay, I think that's about it. Happy to hear anybody's comments, and if anybody wants to talk about this more in real time, happy to discuss. Okay, talk to you later. Bye.